So I'm Tim Jones. I'm the Managing Director at Hyprfire. And today's session will be presented by Stefan Prandl, my co-founder and CTO. So in terms of what we at Hyprfire think about Log4j, we think it's a pretty big deal, because if a cyber criminal's exploited this vulnerability before you patch your servers, they're potentially in your network and very difficult to locate and expel. It's a bit like looking for a needle in a haystack. The good news is that that's the kind of thing we do with our Firebug solution. But I guess what we wanted to do is provide a bit more of a sort of background in a nutshell around how we got here, what Log4Shell is, and why existing solutions aren't really that helpful in getting rid of it, or in fact identifying it. So on that note, I'll hand over to Stefan, who will host today's session and give you the wisdom on some of those issues.
All righty, thanks, Tim. Yeah, let's just get into it. So, I mean, if you're in the security incident response game right now, you know that the storm clouds have thoroughly rolled in for your Christmas. But let's just quickly run through what's been going on. So quickly, just in how we got here. So why are we experiencing Log4Shell as it is, or this broad internet spanning attack? And the answer is that we've accidentally created essentially industries of scale for malware production just by paying ransomware. So essentially, because ransomware has been so successful, you've now got these massive industrial enterprises that are performing malicious activity inside the internet. And these guys actually have the money and the need to diversify their capabilities beyond just doing ransomware here and there. And so they're constantly looking for new ways in, they're constantly looking for new gigs to pull, essentially. And one of the things they've got is they've got enough funding and enough expertise to be able to turn around and go, well, what we'll do is we'll actually, read research papers, reverse engineer patches as they come out, and, devise these sorts of new attacks as they happen. So what sort of was the field test and the great warning for this actually happened earlier on this year. And you may remember it as the proxy logon bugs, or if you didn't know what the name of it is, that whole bunch of attacks that hit Exchange servers around the world. And the thing that was notable about that was that what happened was Microsoft released a patch for that after they discovered a Chinese APT using the attacks and strategic sort of, politically and motivated sort of attacks that they were doing. And as soon as they did, the code was reverse engineered and brought online in these vast automated scanning systems just sitting out of the internet, which you can basically, think of as like a guy with a Gatling gun just sweeping it backwards and forwards across the internet, trying to hit every server that was vulnerable to the attack. And that actually happened within about 15 minutes of the patch going live. Now, I don't know about you, but patching all of your servers that might be vulnerable, especially if it's an Exchange server, for example, against something takes a little bit longer than 15 minutes. So if you had an internet-facing Exchange server that was vulnerable, and let's be fair, pretty much all of them were, you were pretty much already hit by the time you'd gotten around to actually patching it. And so it was a massive, massive problem. And what we've actually seen here is the same thing with an exploit that is far wider reaching than just, your run-of-the-mill, if you will, Exchange bug. So what is, Log4Shell? What is Log4Shell, and how is it so much more wide-reaching? Well, Log4Shell actually was discovered last year sometime, late last year, by essentially edgy teenagers trying to take over Minecraft servers. They figured out that you can actually put in this strange, weird string of characters, and you could actually convince the Minecraft server to basically run arbitrary code. And it wasn't until very recently that this was sort of, really identified as a major problem, because essentially what was causing that wasn't Minecraft itself. It was something a little bit deeper. You see, there's this very old, library essentially inside a lot of Java applications called Log4j, which, being software engineers, having this great way of creating terrible acronyms for things, literally just means logging for Java. And so Java applications tend to use it because when you're developing software, when you're trying to see what it's doing, you can't actually see the software. So it helps to actually write down what it's doing. So I am moving this file from this location to this location. And so the Log4j library was designed to make logging for Java applications easier to do and a more centralized sort of way. So everyone knew precisely how to use it. And it was sort of a generic way of doing logging across all Java applications. And this was maintained by the Apache Foundation, who you may know for such fantastic things as, Apache web server, which runs a very large amount of the internet and may give you an inkling as to where this is going. But essentially, this was an extremely widely used logging infrastructure, and it had some really neat features. And one of them was the ability to use any given Java extension as a way of providing more information into your log. So you could turn around and say, you don't have the context to write this log right now, but if you reach out to this server over here and you run this application, or you look into this object space, or you get this information from somewhere else, you can then add that to this log, which will make it more useful for developers, security teams, what have you, when they actually read this log. And essentially what Log4Shell is someone has figured out that you can use format strings. And if you're old enough to remember how, C handles format strings and how those have caused so many Stack Overflow problems in the past, those kinds of format strings, someone has managed to figure out that you can actually give format strings to Log4Shell that basically ask it, hey, you don't have context for this log right now. If you go out to this external server over LDAP and just pull down this bit of information and then essentially execute it, that will give you the reference that you need for this particular log, which, the problem is that means you can now basically tell any given machine with Java logging software, which is pretty much everything running Java, hey, can you just go out and run some arbitrary code from my server, which as an attacker is pretty much a backdoor into literally everything running Java that's accessible to the internet. And one of the big problems is that's been one of Java's big strengths because of its universal applicability. It's everywhere. It's used pretty much everywhere. Apache server itself isn't necessarily vulnerable, but something that runs alongside it in a lot of modern web applications, especially when you're using containerization, called Apache struts, is. And so basically every Apache server that's running Apache struts or that's running Apache Tomcat, you can go to a text field or a URL field and put in this format string, and suddenly you have compromised that server. It goes a little beyond that though, because even if your server itself is not vulnerable, the logs that it generates will have that format string in them. So anything that reads the format string that happens to be vulnerable is essentially now compromised. It's sort of like a basilisk, right? Once you see it, if you're vulnerable, that's it, it's too late. And what's really interesting is how many cybersecurity toolkits and log management toolkits use Java to break down strings. So things like Elasticsearch and Logstash, which are really, really handy systems for managing your logs to centralized logging locations, are actually vulnerable to this attack. So in the process of collecting and centralizing your logs, you're actually making your log server the backdoor for the attackers. And if you've got something like Splunk, when this attack came out, Splunk itself was vulnerable. So if Splunk, in reading all of your web application logs, attempting to, centralize that information and get some idea on, what the security implications are, well, unfortunately, the Splunk agent itself would be compromised. Some really wacky things are things like, if you know of AWS Lambda, which is a toolkit for executing code arbitrarily in the cloud, that was vulnerable itself, which means I can only imagine what the Christmas of the Amazon engineers must be right now, because they've essentially got thousands of shells just randomly placed throughout their entire virtualized environment. And essentially what this means is that attackers can just get something onto a machine. So what they've done is they've paired this with the initial approach that they had from the Exchange bug, which is essentially we need to get into as many systems as we can before patching is completed. So what they're doing is they're using that initial access provided by the Log4Shell shell, essentially, to download and install backdoors of various kinds. At the moment, they're very, very simple en masse sort of backdoors. They're web shells. They're very simple ways of gaining access. They're very obvious to a lot of systems. But the problem is that the ones like the APTs, the smarter sort of attackers, have better approaches. Like, for example, fileless malware, like, for example, laterally moving immediately, and like, for example, what we saw during the end of the Exchange server proxy logon saga, fully automated ransomware that executes once the exploit is engaged. All right, so how do you know if you've actually been hit by this? And the answer is, if you run a web application using Apache and it runs either Tomcat or struts, you've probably already been hit. These things have scanned pretty much the entire internet, and they're coming back around and back around again. And essentially, if you have a machine that is vulnerable, you're in trouble. So the best case scenario is that you know precisely what kind of applications and services run on your network and that your company provides and what sort of applications they're built upon. And that will tell you immediately if you need to bring things offline and fix them. Now, the problem is most organizations don't know that. So you kind of have to ask your team, and then your team has to do some investigation to figure out exactly what is in the organization that could be hit. And all during that time, those things could have been hit, compromised, and now being used to pivot into the rest of your network. The only way you can guarantee that you have been hit is if you can find a JNDI format string like the one you've got on your screen right now somewhere in your logs, because essentially what that is the format string that is used by the attackers to execute the attack. You've got a JNDI request with LDAP to some place, and then very entertainingly, attackers tend to use things like exploit, virus, attack. They're not at all subtle about it. It's very obvious that they're doing something. But if you do find one of these logs and it's pointing to somewhere outside of your organization, then you know that at least someone has attempted to hit you. And it probably means you've been compromised. Now, the problem is that finding this is an incredibly difficult job because you can't really rely on log software to find it, as that log software itself can be compromised by the attack while trying to process it. So very often what you have to do is you'd have to have a set of threat hunters, potentially just your IT team. Hopefully, if you're really lucky, you've got an actual squad of threat hunters on staff who would then have to go through every single set of application logs on your externally facing applications and make sure that, you know, they haven't had that event happen and that there's been no artifacts of compromise that have then appeared afterwards, like, for example, web shells, like, for example, strange users, like, for example, edits to the login, to the password files, that sort of thing. Now, the problem is that that's not really a great way of handling this. There's no hard and fast sort of way of, okay, I've been compromised because of the way that this works. So what you really want to be looking for at the moment is, while you're going through and trying to identify these servers to patch, you want to be looking for lateral movement. I know some organizations have just taken down broad swaths of servers to just be sure. But, you know, realistically, what you're looking for are people trying to move around, which, of course, in and of itself requires a lot of threat hunting and a lot of toolkits, which, again, may have been compromised at this point by the attack itself. So why is network security basically your only hope in this scenario? And that's realistically because, like, for example, with Firebug, our flagship product, we do network analytics with no deep packet inspection and specifically hunt lateral movement. So the first things first is we can identify when something like the initial attack LDAP request is made without actually having to see the query that was done. So, you know, we cannot be essentially basilisked by that particular string. It can't possibly be passed by Firebug. Firebug will still notice the event and go, why is someone trying to, dial out using LDAP outside of your organization? But the second and most important thing is, even if you have not gotten to it at the point of attack, which you probably haven't because it's already swept through the internet, the next thing we do is we hunt for that lateral movement. Attackers, as of yet, haven't really gotten to the point of coming back around to every single one of their backdoors and figuring out what they now have access to. But once they start doing that, they will have to go through the early stages of lateral movement, which requires things like enumeration, which requires things like going around and figuring out what kind of machines are out there, which basically requires them doing a whole bunch of reconnaissance. And Firebug's really good at picking up that kind of reconnaissance. And again, it can do that without having to be itself vulnerable to the attacks that they're using. The other thing is that this kind of attack, because it's web-based, can be done over fully encrypted traffic. In fact, most of the time it's TLS. And this basically means that if you've got something that actually inspects packets, it can't actually inspect the packet and it can't see that request string because, well, it's encrypted. Whereas, again, Firebug doesn't really care about that. It can actually see unusual events inside TLS streams simply through the statistical weirdness of someone attempting to get your server to dial back out to an LDAP machine somewhere and who knows where. The other important thing to remember is that this has happened twice now, and it will happen again. And the next thing that happens, it might affect, this might not have affected your machines as of yet, but the next one that comes through might affect, your entire web infrastructure. It might affect your databasing servers. It might affect, you have no idea. We have no idea what could possibly be the affected things. But again, because Firebug is looking for the network normalcy and not having to actually look into these packets, it's going to see the weird stuff. It's going to give you early warning, and it's not going to turn around and get affected by that attack itself. So why is that your only real approach? Well, firewalls and endpoint protection really aren't helping you too much, primarily because the firewalls don't tend to do deep packet inspection, and most organizations have an any outbound rule set. We tend to deploy a whole bunch of services and devices internally, and we don't really go, well, what precise things do you need to access back out on the internet? Because there are so many things that modern services require out on the internet that we can't just enumerate all of them. So we kind of say, we'll stop the bad guys from coming in, but on going out, we don't really mind. And that's the problem with this attack. The going in is very well hidden inside TLS and inside a regular web request, but the going back out is the kind of dangerous thing, and no one's really watching it because we can't. So software that does do the deep packet inspection, your fun stuff like, for example, FortiGate XDR, at least when the attack started, were vulnerable. So in their attempt to actually identify the malicious behavior themselves, they became part of the problem. Attacks, that also take place from places of trust at the moment, because attackers are running these, they're enterprises, right? They can take advantage of enterprise grade stuff. And for example, they've been running scanners out of AWS or Azure. And we've actually seen examples of AWS scanners where the system that's scanning is in AWS. And so naturally, reputation wise, it's totally legitimate. And then the machine that it's calling back out to over LDAP is also in AWS. So simply from an IP level, you have no idea that's a bad reputation actor. Nothing's going to tell you. Endpoint is also a bit of an issue. Most of the time, we don't usually have endpoint install on Linux servers. Most of the time, the systems that we're installing are Windows specific, and the systems that are vulnerable here are heavily weighted towards Linux. So, realistically, the only sorts of things that we have in terms of endpoint security on Linux systems are log processing stuff. And the big favorite one there is Logstash and FileBeat, which are vulnerable to this kind of attack. So the actual endpoint systems themselves can be the problem. Your web server may be completely fine, but suddenly Logstash, in its attempt to pick up and analyze this log, has now dialed out to the attacker. And attacks run in the Java VM. So we haven't really seen too many of them, or at least we haven't seen too many of them right now, but it's completely feasible that the attacks can be completely fileless in design, much like the Exchange attacks could be completely fileless using PowerShell. And deep packet inspection is not that useful because, again, it's got to detect attacks that are fairly, that have been actually had signatures written for them. And at least initially, there were no signatures for this because by the time the attackers had managed to roll out to automating their attack process, well, the security companies were still trying to build that out and push out those updates. The attackers are very, very fast. Remember, when we had the Exchange situation, we were looking at a mean time to inventory, not a mean time to exploit deployment, but a mean time to your machine being acquired by the attackers is about 15 minutes from the release of the announcement of the the actual exploit. So deep packet inspection, is only going to detect things after it's been properly updated, which may take enough time that the attackers have already compromised your machines. And on top of that, you're only going to see partial attacks. You're only going to see attacks that are unencrypted. If attackers are smart and they're just rolling over HTTPS and not even trying using HTTP, then you're not going to see any of those. You may see essentially the less skilled attackers who are doing obvious stuff, but you're not going to see the more skilled guys who are probably the ones that you're more worried about. TLS is pretty much everywhere. I mean, Chrome at these days will actually expect TLS and warn you if it's not. And that essentially defeats deep packet inspection all by itself. Now that basically means that deep packet inspection has to rely on detecting the next stage of attack. So them pulling down software, them laterally moving, and that can have so many different forms that it might be really, really hard for these to actually identify and classify, especially if it's going from your now already compromised machine out of your network, which is generally an any rule. So that's pretty much it on why we have a serious problem right now and why our cybersecurity types are having a pretty bad pre-Christmas experience. We're now on to Q&A for anyone that's interested. Back to Tim.
Yeah, thanks, Stefan. So yeah, we'll just take this opportunity for Q&A. If you have a question, yeah, feel free just to take yourself off mute and go ahead, or if you know how to raise your hand, let's do that. Just while we're waiting for people to think about questions, I guess just a bit of a non-technical question, Stefan. What if someone is on our network? What kind of things can attackers be doing? We can't see what they're doing. What are they likely to be doing while they're hanging around?
As for right now, what they're probably doing is identifying what exactly in your organization makes you valuable. So I guess the ransomware playbook is generally step one, get access. Well, they've probably got that now, and then step two, figure out what to hit. So we're probably well in that stage at the moment. So you've got people wandering through networks going, okay, I've got like 200,000 backdoors. Let's grab the first one and start wandering through and going, okay, what data is here and what kind of organization am I in? What's the likelihood on my return for investment, where investment is just the licensing cost for the ransomware. So they're now trying to figure out what you do, how much your turnover is, if you've got cyber insurance, because that of course changes how much they're going to charge you, what sort of information you couldn't live without, if you have backups, and if they can actually compromise those backups. They're going to be trying to find all of those things and then assess all of that so that they know basically how best to provide you with ransomware services, which, isn't a great thing, but, it's what they do. They're a business.
Okay, that's great. So we don't have any questions just yet. Well, I guess let's have a look at, maybe if you can show us, how we would use Firebug to deal with this kind of thing.
Yeah, okay. So how we actually have been using it in these sorts of events, which have happened over the last week and a bit, which has just been great fun, lots of early mornings and late nights for me, is essentially we're hunting for two things. The first one being abnormal LDAP enumeration or requests externally, and the other one is for lateral movement internally. And I believe we've actually got in here a quick little demo video, which is actually of...
Share it.
Yeah. Am I sharing? I'm pretty sure I am. But yeah, this is of an internal enumeration attempt. And essentially what we can do is we can use Firebug once we've deployed. It takes about an hour to learn what normal is, and then we can actually identify abnormal stuff. So we usually deploy, wait a little bit, and then start producing reports for the organization. And in this case, we've got right here, hey, we've got potential LDAP enumeration, which is really, really solid early stage enumeration / lateral movement behavior. Basically, an attacker's going, what's out there? What can I find that I can actually then use to, move on to it? What can I go and attack? And so what we've actually managed to do here is really, really quickly determine that even though the LDAP request may be encrypted for its own security, we've been able to determine that a specific machine, 10.1.1.11, has actually been doing LDAP requests. And if we look down here through the little search menu, it's been doing it a bit. So someone's obviously compromised that machine and has been going through and going, hey, what's out there? What can I actually use? And we've been looking for that usually in the case of Log4Shell, basically we've been looking at that from a DMZ or from a web-facing system, or wherever the systems happen to be that we believe the compromise happen to be, in some cases security systems themselves, where they're trying to move in to the rest of the network. I mean, Firebug's really, really good with strategic deployment. So placing it, for example, in the gap between the DMZ and the rest of the corporate network, and then specifically going, all right, we're looking for LDAP, SMB, SSH, RDP, any lateral movement approach from inside the DMZ into the corporate network, because we know that no one's supposed to be doing that right now, because we're currently trying to assess how badly we've been owned by, say, Log4Shell, and we're now trying to figure out if anyone's trying to move further into the network. And Firebug's been picking that sort of stuff up and basically going, okay, not only can we pick up new attacks coming in, we can also pick up guys that are already in, have already deployed, and even after you've patched, may still have a backdoor in there that you're not aware of. That's okay. Firebug will be able to go, hey, that guy's actually now trying to do something that he shouldn't be doing. You may want to go and revisit your response on that machine, try and figure out where they've come in from, what they're doing on there, what sort of persistence they've managed to build.
Okay, great. What kind of what kind of attacks are we seeing in terms of attackers who have exploited Log4Shell or Log4j? What's kind of the first round of attacks that we're seeing off the back of that?
So I guess at the moment, we haven't seen particularly too many. The obvious ones are really quick and fast ransomware attacks. So, people will have jumped onto a web server, gone, this web server talks to an SQL server. I will encrypt the SQL server and then we'll go for broke there. But generally speaking, ransomware, I guess, agents have sort of gotten to the point now where they know they need to do a bit more reconnaissance before they can really sink their teeth into someone. And that's because most of us have backups these days, and hopefully they are off-site, offline backups, which basically mean that the attackers can't reach them. So if attackers know that those backups are there, they can identify how they can actually deal with that, because in and of itself, having a backup means that, they can't necessarily force you to pay money, because, you could pay them for your data back, or you could just restore from backup. So there are some, probably low skill, go for broke sort of operators that are trying to get their money out of this right now. But what's more scary are the ones that haven't acted yet. And generally speaking, most of those guys have not been seen using this as of yet, or at least haven't been seen taking the next step. And when that starts happening, we'll get a whole nother round of, hey, this is now going on, because when they start attacking, when they start executing their malware, sort of their ransomware campaigns, that'll be a serious problem. Again, everything from now until those start happening, the attackers can be investigating your network, they can be looking through stuff. And if they're very skilled, the more modern approach to ransomware is to not just ransom you for the recovery of your data, but to ransom you so that they don't post it online. So if you've got IP, if you've got critical information, if you've got client information, not only can they encrypt that and prevent you from using it, but if you then go, well, I've got backups and I'm fine, they can go, well, we spent the last 2 months downloading all of that. We're going to post all of that online. So your competitors, your client base, the government, everyone can see that. And that in and of itself is something they're like, pay us if you don't want that to happen.
Okay. So I guess the message is, the window that we have at the moment is where, we can be monitoring for lateral movement inside network movement while they're scoping out the networks to see how they're going to mess things up for people.
Yeah. Generally speaking, at this point, you've probably, if you're just acting now, you've probably missed the golden opportunity to catch them on that first initial entry, but you probably weren't going to catch that anyway. You need to act quickly to get the visibility of your devices and of the network in general to identify if you have been hit and if attackers are attempting to utilize that capability before they have a chance to actually utilize it. So, the reason everyone's having a bad Christmas is because everyone's pretty much acting now.
Okay, great. Look, we're coming up pretty close against the 30 minutes. so conscious of everyone's time. If you would like to find out more about hyprfire and Firebug, please check out our website. We've got quite a bit of information there. So hyprfire.com, spelled that way. Yeah, please get in touch, and we'd love to have a chat. We're pretty excited because, we think that Firebug is really built for this kind of thing. We are designed to look for needles in haystacks inside networks, and we're here to help. We'd love to help you guys. So thanks very much for joining, and we hope to speak to you very soon down the track.